before you begin to tell it like it is, you always have to test the mic, whether it carries your word like it is. So, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಿರುವಂತ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಬ್ಬರಿಗೂ ಆತ್ಮೀಯ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ, ಸ್ವಾಗತ. And how are we audible to the last benchers? Backbenchers? Ashtena, that's the noise we hear. Okay, attendance roll call is done. So one of the expectations when you have journalists on a panel at a literature festival is that there will be fights. There will be these easy, at least, soundbite chunks that people can carry back. Is each of you prepared for this expectation from the audience? Gideon, you first.
Born to fight. I'm an Australian after all.
Sagarika, you've already had a rehearsal. We also got told that you were mobbed on your way out.
Can I give the audience a bit of advice? Only if you have low blood pressure should you watch the 9 o'clock news. Please switch it off. Or maybe watch Rajdeep. You can watch Rajdeep.
It's all in the family.
But don't watch the 9, unless you want to really to put yourself in a kind of cardiac predicament, switch off television news.
Who said family and dynasties only in politics? Watch us, media. Suhasini.
Well, I honestly think that the adversarial relationship that the media should have with those in power is something that needs now to be trained. It's too easy to just take in that WhatsApp, take in that call that somebody gives you, that guidance somebody gives you, that access somebody gives you. But if you're looking for real stories, you'll have to build for yourself an adversarial relationship with those in power. And conversely, if we're sitting at this end, we should be able to take it if we dish it out.
I have one comment to that. The concept of balance worries me. I don't like this concept that you've got to be balanced, monkey balancing, this side, that side. The journalist is told, somebody says it's raining. Somebody says it's not raining. Is the journalist supposed to say, oh, he says it's raining, somebody else says it's not raining, so maybe it's raining? No. You look outside the window and see if it's raining. And if it's raining, you say it's raining. If it's not, you say it's not. So journalists have to speak truth to power and have to always be contrapoda, contrary to the establishment, whoever that establishment may be.
So Sagarika, you've in fact answered the question before, given the answer before I asked the question, which was that for the first round, if each of us can actually say what journalism means to you, and who in this day, this age, is your idea of a good journalist. You can choose to name a person, or you can just choose to abstract that person with qualities of good journalism. Who wants to go first?
Is it on now? Yeah.
That's a very vocal audience, even if they don't have the mic.
The best kind. I think if you were to ask me what's the best kind of journalist today, I would say it's a skeptic. It's somebody who refuses to believe what they're being told. Because we live in times really where we're actually expected not to scrutinize what is offered to us. We live in times where we are asked not to look for the extra angle on a story because it should be very clear what the story is. We're living in times when the politicians right at the top are trying to tell us as journalists that we don't need to exist because they have a direct connection with the people, that they are voted by the people and therefore can only be scrutinized in this one-way conversation that they hold with the people. Many of them don't actually even submit themselves to press conferences. So I think you need to be, as a journalist, I think you need to be, as a journalist, a skeptic with the hide of a rhino, because you will be ridiculed, you will be trolled on Twitter, you will be, outed on WhatsApp and on other social media. And worse, you might actually even be abandoned by your own media friends or called out by your own media friends. So I think that would answer for me what is the true value of a journalist in today's times. And I'm not just talking about India anymore. There are democracies across the world that are making this transition to a kind of authoritarian democracy where journalists are just not expected to question.
Now, taking from what Suhasini has said, Gideon, if I come to you and you look at a stadium of India supporters at the World Cup final, and you say your thing, and then what happens? Is that what used to happen when you started off in journalism? What does being a journalist mean to you today, and what was it like when you started off?
I think certain verities about journalism are as true as the day that I started. There's a maxim of Lord Northcliffe's, which I've always called to mind, which is that a good journalist is interested in everyone but themselves. A journalist can be too interesting. It can be too infatuated with their own point of view. Our job is to find the truth. Our job is to look for the stories that other journalists have neglected. And as I get older and as I get more experienced, I find that a very compelling mission. I think the other thing about journalism is that it's a tremendous license for curiosity. You should always be prepared to be surprised. You should always be telling yourself that you don't know the story until you've actually gone out to report it. Axiomatically, journalism is sometimes accused of getting the facts and drawing them towards a pre-existing headline. That's the worst kind of journalism, the one that panders to the author and the regime's pre-existing set of prejudices. You should always be looking for the richness and the diversity and the surprises of mankind. They're much richer than anything that could come from your imagination.
So before I actually go to Sagarika, let's compare a situation when you say, let's say, you speak the truth as you see it in your, in the game that was in India. Now, if you were to compare a scenario when you're talking about the British in UK, let's say from one of your books, like In the Ashes. Now, do you have similar intolerance from people there when you're, let's say, taking on, as a London-born Australian speaking about the British?
Being Australian, I've got a capacity for annoying everyone, not least of all the English. And we certainly did a little of that this summer in England. But you also, one of the things that's probably different from me and the other panellists here is that I'm not on social media at all, because I don't see how it makes me a better journalist. I think if something's happening in the world, I'll find out about it soon enough. This idea that I have to be instantly on top of every single unfolding event is a bit of a misnomer, because what can I really do with them in the scheme of things? And you can confuse yourself. You can just find yourself operating in an atmosphere of constant distraction and of noise. You shouldn't necessarily be thinking about how your views are going to be received all the time. You should just go about finding your way. Yeah, thanks. You should just go about finding your way to a well-informed and reasonable and well-argued position, and then be prepared to stand by it.
Now, the journalist who doesn't mind being critiqued or as you said, shouldn't be really bothering about what people say. We also had this discussion that even newspapers by extension should be like that it's okay to annoy their readers. It's okay to give another point of view, because all of us are so cozily in our echo chambers, we do not even want to hear another point of view. And that's how newspapers have to serve.
I learn much more from people I disagree with than those I do. And I see that as fundamental to the newspaper's role, which is to present points of view that the reader might not agree with, might not have considered, but would be better off for knowing, if only to test their own point of view.
So you are writing columns in the newspaper, being an independent journalist, after having been in the, let's say, the mainstream media, Sagarika. So what made you step out of that treadmill? And is that, how do you function when you know that probably the government of the day, and that applies to Suhasini as well, could be sensitive to criticism?
I'll just pick up from what Gideon was saying and what Suhasini was saying as well. Do we believe, if I can ask a big umbrella question, do we believe that democracy needs to be saved? How many believe that democracy is worth it and needs to be saved? If democracy needs to be saved, we need to save the journalist. If we criminalize the journalist, if we make the journalist an anti-national, if we make the journalist an urban Naxal, if we make the journalist the Khan Market gang or Tukre gang or this gang or that gang, you are criminalizing truth-telling. And without truth-telling, democracies cannot function.
But is truth really, the dimension
I'm just coming to that. What is truth? Now, is truth, as Gideon was saying, truth is not the views of a star journalist or somebody hollering the nation wants to know at 9 p.m. every evening. Truth is actually what we find when we go out there when we don't know what the story is. We don't know what the facts are. We don't know what's happened and how many people have been affected. And what we find, that is the truth. Today, we are entering the era of post-truth. Because electoral autocracy is spreading across the world, and as Suhasini said, the epidemic of elected dictators, populist demagogues are spreading fake news across social media platforms. We have the social mediaification of journalism, where we're constantly exaggerating, labeling people fascist, communist, genocide. This is all the social mediaification of vocabulary. The fact is, but for democracies to function, we have to have the journalists seeking and telling the truth. Because if you're going to create policy, if you're going to have justice, if you're going to benefit the poor, if you're going to aid the suffering, you need the truth. You can't have policies without truth. And I would say that, the social media tech platforms are actually actively undermining the ecosystem needed for democracy to survive.
But do you agree with that, Suhasini?
Well, I differ in the sense that I don't think the platform matters as much. I think the journalism people do matters. After all, there are a lot of people out there doing good journalism on social media. But I think that eventually it is about the quality of journalism. And I use, three sort of rules, if you like, when I'm speaking, especially to journalism students. And that is go to the ground, remain grounded, and stand your ground. And I'll explain very quickly what I mean by that. So long as you're doing all three of those, you sort of can get on any media, TV, radio, newspapers, online, and put out great journalism. The first being go to the ground. If you're not on the ground, or if you haven't spent a good part of your career reporting from the ground, it is going to be that much more difficult for you to bring that quality into your commentary. And I think the two journalists here just say that. And Vasanthi's a voice that you know for so long because of her own ground experience. To say, remain grounded is something of what Gideon said. Remember, I think Jimmy introduced Bangalore Lit Fest as living on love and fresh air. I would say journalists live on trolling and fresh air, to be honest, because we don't get paid that much. Journalism is not a celebrity profession. We might be, standing there with a celebrity, but that's because we're interviewing them. So remember that always, that people are not coming to you because of some star quality, but because you have a job to do, a public service to fulfill. I don't even think journalists are meant to be liked. Forget being popular or, getting follows or getting retweeted and all the rest. You're not actually supposed to be liked. You're supposed to be that slightly, to use the Hindi word, khadoos chap sitting behind a desk with a pile of newspapers they haven't yet finished, who really doesn't want necessarily to be popular. And the last thing I'll say is stand your ground. Because right now, if you ask me where you're seeing the good journalists, those are the journalists who are not following the trend of just taking what is given to them as a given. You know, there's a great book by Frank Dicotter, and you're all literature lovers here, but it's a great book called How to Be a Dictator. And he says in there, everyone knows that an authoritarian leader or an authoritarian government wants you to do what they say. But very few work on the idea that they want you to say what they say. In other words, if you're not repeating what an authoritarian regime wants you to say, or you're not repeating what they're already saying, you're already rebelling. You're already part of the good journalists.
The session name title is Telling It Like It Is. And I think we are now on to something more profound. If you're saying, we have to seek the truth, we have to speak the truth. Now, the truth has dimensions. And that is, I think, the starting point of the big conflict within the journalism community itself. I don't wish to divide this panel into very obvious binaries of Godi media and the other media, so to speak. No, but versus the other media, I said, Sagarika. So I'm saying that, I mean, that's again a perception, but I don't think we should fall into the trap. My question is as simple as this. Now, I, for instance, have finished my solo journeys during election time and otherwise into 15 states of India. And when I'm going in, let's say, deep travel, about 20, 25 days, I don't wish to really seek any political patronage. You're trying to be with the people, seek the pulse, and yet there are so many complexities on the ground that sometimes journalists on their own cannot be trusted that their view is the right view. Now, here is where I find, and this is something I've learned even after my stint with National News Media, it's almost like thinking that this is when my journey is actually beginning. And even within, you know, the larger media, and Gideon, I'm going to ask you this, that for someone who is, 3 decades and more in the profession, how do you, in your, I mean, you're more than cricket. I know you're probably of the 50 books you've written, about 25, 30 maybe about cricket and more about the other ones as well. How do you deal with what you are saying? How much do you trust you yourself alone? And how much do you lean in on, let's say, people who you trust within your community or the people who are your source?
That's a good question. I mean, you tend to... a journalist is skeptical of everything they're told. You know, every person who tells you something has a reason probably for telling you. Every person who imparts a piece of information to you is doing so in order that you'll see things the same way as they do. So you have to be constantly on your mettle in order to interpret other people's motives. It's not that they're dishonest. It's not that they're mendacious. It's simply that they have an opinion and they want you to share it. It's natural for them to want to enlist you in their way of seeing the world. That doesn't necessarily make them a bad person. You also, it was interesting to hear Suresh Menon and Mike Brearley talk about it earlier on today. I often write in order to find out what I think. I don't know what I think until I sit down to start writing it. Until I pursue a particular line of reasoning and I find that I can go no further. Not only at that point do I realise, actually, you know, I might be wrong. Yep. It's important for you to allow for the fact that you might be wrong, that you might have prejudged what you've come to. That's another important part of journalism, is abandoning your preconceptions, abandoning those things that you think you already know. But sometimes those are the hardest things for you to do without.
Now, when you do that,
can I just add one thing? Is that, you know, for those of us who joined journalism 30 years ago, and I think Gideon is 40, 3 decades ago, we had the integrity of the newsroom process, you know, which is when a reporter comes with raw copy, it lands on the desk of the editor, that then goes to the sub-editor, that then goes to the news editor, that then goes to the department editor, until finally it's verified and checked and made possible to be printed. I belong to that generation. I'm a fan of the slow, not of the fast. Today, everything is fast. I'm a fan of the slow. Because slow is exactly what you said. When you get it wrong, when you may have your biases crept in there, when the truth may not be how you've seen it, there are those verified, solid stages in the newsroom that sets your copy right.
In the absence of that, Sagarika, in the age of social media, you've said something, and then let's say this whole thing that we are reflecting on, saying that, okay, probably I got that bit wrong, and I want to probably put this out, you would be seen as doing a U-turn. Now, it takes a totally different turn altogether. And then there would be the before and now kind of position that the journalist opens herself to. How do you, in this, how are you practicing your craft? Now, let's say the Khalistan issue. Yeah? So contentious and even Gideon sports, which is considered now nationalist. It's just gone beyond a sport. You have to be loyal, no matter what you as a journalist hold as truth. So how do you all see this evolution of your craft, and how have you prepared and gotten yourself to the next stage?
Well, I think if you are on the ground, if you go to the ground, there is a set of facts that's in front of you. And when you write your story, it's informed by that. If you're writing commentary, if you're writing a column, then that brings in your opinion, but then that is portrayed as your opinion. So the first rule is really to separate the two, from your reportage to what is your opinion and what is essentially an opinion to engage with. I think the second part is to have the institutionalized attitude towards you sometimes being wrong. And for that, you need to, we have at The Hindu, we have a corrections column simply just for this, to make sure that if you've got something wrong, there's no shame. People do get things wrong. Although, as a journalist, you know that that's like the worst day of your life is when you wake up and you've got a great story and then you are the only one who sees that one wrong fact or the typo that slipped in. And some of those typos don't show up on the computer. They just show up when it's actually printed. But you do have to have an institutionalized system that gives the journalist the understanding, look, remain on the ground, remain humble about the idea that you can have got something wrong. And if you have, say sorry, apologize, correct it immediately.
At this point, I really want to do a hat tip to those journalists in India, outside, who really do what they do in conflict or otherwise in independent ways, who do not have institutional backing, who really face that risk, whether we are talking about beyond the cities, in rural India. I've met so many of these amazing journalists. And so when we are speaking about journalism as a profession, I certainly want to make it as broad and inclusive. I'm also going to ask the audience, if you have questions at this point of time, you can quickly put up your hands. And yes, we are coming to you. We are coming to you, and I shall remember, yes, so we could probably have the mics reach out to them in just a little bit. So if we are talking about what the past of journalism was and the values that something, we probably came into the profession because it meant something, probably it does mean to even those who are right now practicing journalism as a profession, but just have so many things to shoot at. There is a whole world of fake news. There is, of course, AI-enabled news, which is so hard to sift. I mean, we are looking at a future which is just as complex as it gets. How do journalists in terms of if we have to enter the future machine, and how do you look at this, Gideon?
Well, it's interesting that you refer to journalism as a profession. I've never regarded it as such. To me, a profession is being a doctor or a lawyer, where there is a very systematic process of instruction and a very explicit set of qualifications to reach. I didn't go to university. I learned journalism for 40 years, basically just doing it. And my view of journalism is that it's basically very, very simple. You can master the principles of journalism in 6 weeks, a half-intelligent person can, but you can spend the rest of your lifetime trying to get it as right as you possibly can. It's an area in which you should feel as though you are constantly improving. You should be better than you were a year ago and much better than you were 2 years ago, and hopefully you'll be better a year hence, because it'll be more versatile, because experience is invaluable. That experience that tells you that this story does not quite stack up, or that you've seen a version of this story before, or that this information has come to you for a very particular reason, that you're being pushed in a certain direction. Skepticism is not something that you can just announce. It's something that you actually have to learn, and the only way that you learn journalism is by doing it.
We are speaking about the good journalist, But what about media with its own agenda? Where do we begin there?
We have to ask a very fundamental question, Vasanthi, and that's a great question you've asked. Because if we're looking at the future of independent media in India, we have to ask who owns the media, right? Who are the owners of journalists? I'm talking about mainstream journalists. Now, in India, there is no regulation that disallows cross-media ownership, right? So a single entity, a single multimillionaire can own a newspaper, can own a television channel, can own a website, can own media across the board. So you have the one individual with massive ownership of media, and that individual, if aligned to the government, means that all those media outlets become then part of the official machinery of the regime. So the media apparatus becomes something that is at the service of the regime because media is owned increasingly by 2 or 3 very rich men, right? Who not only own the TVs, not only own the newspapers, not only own the websites, all of that. Now, in this scenario, how do we regulate television media or digital media, or how do we ensure that, as Vasanthi says, this becomes good journalism? Now, in India, we have a body known as the NBSA, the News Broadcasters Standards Association. But it is not a prerequisite for any channel to become a member of the NBSA in order to get a license. Anyone can get a TV license. You don't have to become a member of the NBSA, nor do you have to accept the statutory guidelines of the NBSA. Therefore, you can be a freelance player bankrolled by a very rich industrialist who does not accept the guidelines of the NBSA because it has no statutory power, right? So in terms of content, then there is no regulation or no internal regulation on what media is doing or what it is putting out. Who steps in this unregulated anarchy? Which entity steps into this unregulated chaos? We have, a crescendo on social media, a crescendo in the media, which is unregulated. Who steps in? The entity that steps into the anarchy is the government. Because the government will then come in and say, we will decide what is fake news, as is happening in India. We will decide what is the truth, as we said. We will decide which journalist is patronized, which journalist is ostracized. We will decide which media to favor with interviews. We will decide which media to ignore. And because the media is so captured, it's so completely captive, and these media channels are dependent on politicians. You want them to come to your award ceremony, your conclaves, your annual jamborees, your prize distribution ceremonies, or whatever. You don't want to anger the regime, which in any case, your ownership might be very close to. So it's a kind of nexus. And which is why I think what you're doing is very brave, because you're one of the independent outlets and you're using social media. But I think that the challenges for independent journalism in India is, first of all, who owns the media? Why is media not regulated by media houses, by in-house journalist bodies? Because we need to self-regulate. We don't want government regulation. Why is it that governments are so openly partisan when it comes to disbursing favors, and why can't we have more media unity? And fourth, the crisis of content. There are over 400 news channels in India today. All of them are competing for the advertising pie. Now, advertising is driven by TRPs, which is what is leading to the crisis of content.
You mentioned advertisers, you've mentioned the number of channels, probably even 500, I would say, as some data I was reading. But if you're spoken about the journalist individual, the media house, then there is the viewer perception. Whether you take about Tamil channels or Kannada or wherever, Hindi, across the regions, there is a perception that the viewer will already know the slant that the channel takes. So gone are those days when probably you kind of, placed all your trust in the channel that you are watching. Now I will probably say that, okay, this is pro this party, that is anti that party. So I have to see 2 or 3 more channels to come up with my truth. How does the viewer make sense? Suhasini, one of the difficulties I have had so many friends who say, you know what, I don't watch TV anymore. I don't have a TV set anymore. But you don't need a TV set anymore. I mean, it's there in social media. There are all these snatches. But ultimately, despite having been spoiled for choices, the viewer is shortchanged, or the listener, or the reader, because you don't even know who to believe. There is such a crisis of credibility. How do you see the viewer?
You know, I think you are actually echoing something that we hear all the time, which is this idea of we don't know who to believe. Well, I would say invest in what you are learning. After all, each of you has your own professions. You have your own careers. You are leaving it to a different profession, that of journalists, of reporters, of news agencies, to give you the news of the day. So invest a little bit of yourself in that. I sincerely believe the way we are going, and you're right, that people are not watching television. Some of it is because that idea of appointment viewing has gone. Everybody expects to see what they need to on their telephones and go to an aggregator and get it if they need to. But it's a larger question of the journalism that you want to see. You have to learn to invest in it. At the end of the day, do you want newspapers, do you want television channels to be completely dependent on advertising that in large parts comes from the government? Or do you want those news agencies to be dependent on you, to have you as the viewer, the reader, the listener, as their essentially the person that they're producing that news for? I think it's an important thing to ask yourself also. I hear a lot, we've moved, the Hindus moved behind a paywall in recent years, and we get asked a lot. And I know that it's inconvenient, because how many newspapers are you going to pay the subscription to? But you are going to have to make those choices. We are going to have to work harder on making sure that you get at least the services that you are indenting for, with good journalism, with better writing, with more fact-checking of the news, with more explanations that we provide. But I think it has to be a bhagidari, if you like, between the reader and those in the fourth estate, which is under threat otherwise. Because if you leave it to news organizations to find their own way, they will eventually walk down the slippery slope where you need advertising, you need government patronage, you need access to people in power in order to go and get the good stories. And I'm sure all of you have your own favorite writers. Much of it is about the echo chamber, but much of it is because you think that person doesn't lie to you.
No, Vasanthi, the day of the single source news is over. Don't rely on the single source news. One single newspaper, one single television program, one single website, those days are gone. If you want to get the truth, consult a variety that you have on offer.
But are we really doing that? And this is something which I'm coming to Gideon. And the person in the audience who had a question, do you have the mic yet? Yeah, can we? I think he asked the question first.
He's been asking questions for a long time.
Oh, I see. So, to do some soul searching, all the mess that we've just now pointed out, Suhasini and Sagarika have said
Hello.
that. Are we to,
Hello.
I mean, how much are we to blame for ourselves for getting to this point that we have lost the trust of the very viewer, reader, who we were supposed to serve with the most accurate news? How do you see this?
Well, I mean, journalism is run by businesses, as Sagarika was saying, and businesses have an interest in attracting the largest possible audience. Now, one of the biggest changes actually between the start of our careers and what we have today is that we know exactly on any given day what people are reading, for how long, for how deeply they're getting into the story, and we often have comments to go with it, and we have a social media response. So we automatically know what's popping, what's proving popular, and what's antagonizing our readership. And of course, the natural tendency of a commercial organization is to produce more of what's popular. We're trying to anticipate the reader's needs. We're trying to delight the reader. In fact, we are. We're constitutionally incapable of, or we lean against being deliberately unpopular. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. In the olden days, we didn't know what people were reading. We just had to produce what we thought was best, what we thought was good for them. Yeah. Sometimes we were too condescending. Sometimes we were a little bit patronising towards our readership, but at least we did actually have an idea of our own set of values. These days, our chief priority is what sells. What sells? What delights? What's enchants? And what can we do more of?
You know, I just wanted to add in there that there are actually real-life examples of how this credibility thing works. One of those, for example, is the idea that people don't really want to pay for the news because they're getting it on the internet all the time. Actually speaking, where people have tried to offer the newspapers for free. I know in Israel they had one, they tried one, in India they've had one, in other countries as well. Whenever someone's tried to give you a paper for free, it actually doesn't have the kind of credibility, and actually over time, people don't read it. The other thing I've also seen in terms of our readership, when you were saying, you know, the idea that you tell the reader what you think is important, as opposed to just basically tell them what they already want to watch or read, is the concept of the e-paper. You know, COVID saw a real downturn in terms of how many newspapers were being sold across the country. But online, more and more people are paying for the e-paper, which actually gives them a newspaper's sense of news, what is the first page, what is the op-ed page, rather than just an aggregated news website. So I think those trends are telling us that people want news, people want credible news, they want well-written news that they can trust. And I think media organizations have to move in that direction.
But I do think that newspapers are facing a credibility in terms of losing young readers, you know. Television faces a crisis of content. Newspapers face a crisis of losing young readers. Digital media faces a crisis of remuneration and sustainability. So I think that while there's very good news to be had on newspapers, because the institutional memory of newspapers is still very long, we have still very credible news desks putting out the news. But sadly, as a newspaper columnist, we're losing young readers.
But, and the gentleman with the mic here, the person who's going to ask the first question, yeah, you can now say that. But just one quick point to you. You said that the age of the single source is over. Like all of us have to cultivate these multiple sources. What I see also happening when I do my ground and whatever, grassroots travel, is that people are following multiple sources, but only in that arc of ideology. You're then still stuck with that same one.
That echo chamber.
Yes. So I think that is also a crisis, so to speak, in terms of opinions and perceptions. Yes, please. May you keep your question short and your introduction.
Okay, Anuradha here. I just want to ask, so pre-pandemic, Amal Clooney had come to Australia and did a media conference and spoke about transparent economy. Then there is the whole Europe privacy laws that are there. In US, they came out with a morning show. And then during the pandemic, there was the likes of the Pegasus that came about. So Sagarika, what is your answer to India's way of media?
To Pegasus? Well, it's very, very scary. I mean, the government, you know, using advanced spyware to conduct surveillance on certain citizens. I think that, you know, this ties into what we were earlier talking about, is the growing trend of autocracy in all our democracies. And freedoms and liberties of citizens being seriously curtailed, and the media being, a lot of journalists being put under surveillance because the process of asking questions and the process of holding power to account is seen as criminal. Is seen as somehow anti-national. Is seen as non-nationalistic or non-patriotic. I believe telling the truth is the journalist's greatest patriotic duty. I tell the truth because I want my country to live up to the highest possible standards. I'm not telling the truth because I want to bring my country down. So the trend of, you know, surveillance on journalists, I think, is this process of criminalizing the journalist, where truth-telling is becoming a crime. And I think that is because of the increasing trend of autocracy that is happening across the world. But as Vasanthi was saying, many journalists have brought it on themselves, but that's a whole different story.
It is.